and the protests against Huntington Life Sciences, environmental campaigns of a variety of different types, but in particular the targeting of the expansion of airports, and then anti-capitalist groups who, from opposition to summits to a variety of different types of protests, really beginning the latter part of the 1990s and then throughout that first decade of this century. The other thing that I think had changed significantly from maybe what had happened in the past was firstly that the state's ability to be able to process information about people on an absolutely industrial scale. Much of this information is now obviously stored electronically, and also a different approach to how that information was handled. So there was at the early part of the 2000s that all the way that all intelligence is dealt with was updated and largely borrowed from the police's approach to organised crime. And so much of this was about not so much about finding individuals who may well be arrested for a particular action, for instance, if they're involved in a protest, but building up a profile of entire movements. So understanding where the links and connections may be, which organisation may well be have activists who are also involved in something else, who the key leaders are, what their influences are upon each other. And this is part of the reason why a lot of incredibly small groups suddenly found that they were being spied on. So really from about 2005, you have the emergence of this catch-all term domestic extremists, which is running kind of in parallel to the threats that were being pushed about terrorism. And domestic extremism is a term that has no real legal basis at all. It has changed repeatedly and has pretty much come to mean whatever the police want it to mean. But it certainly has been linked with counter-terrorism, and certainly been linked with threats of violence. And why that label matters, and why it was important for the police to continue to use it, is very similar to the reason why the label of terrorism matters, right? Because it justifies the decision to go ahead with surveillance on different groups. It justifies the targeting of individual organisers. It justifies the greater likelihood that people are going to face arrest. But also what it does is it enables a wide range of different groups, because it's such a vague term, to be brought into the kind of the focus of those units that have existed that are focused on domestic extremism, which has pretty much come to mean any campaign that's involved in any form of civil disobedience or any form of direct action. A part of the reason that that this is relevant to a discussion about the criminalisation of solidarity is because it's also designed to, by linking a group to extremism, to associate them in some way with the type of activities that the wider public may want to avoid, right? Even if they've done nothing unlawful, it's intended to alienate people from protest activities. It's intended to restrict the ability of those organisations to grow, and quite often it's intended to stop them from being able to protest at all, which is the reason why it's a threat to freedom of assembly and to freedom of association. Now, there's been a lot of pushing back on the idea of domestic extremism. In part, that's come about because of the what Shelly hinted at the beginning, which is the exposure of undercover police officers and the activities that they've been involved in, but also just the campaigns to try and say, well, look, if you've got this definition, what does it mean? And we're now moving into a kind of a new phase of where this may go, which is increasingly sophisticated, and which hopefully I'll have a chance to maybe touch on again later in this discussion. But for now, I think I'll leave it there, and I'll come in when others have spoken.
Thanks, Kevin. Really useful bit of history behind this area there. Thank you so much. Just really interesting the point you made about how over time it's become easier for information to be kind of gathered and stored on an industrial scale. And it got me thinking about how we often think about how new communication technology has helped organisers link up and organise protests, but it's obviously also massively assisted policing in cracking down on those same people. Our next speaker is an anthropologist, a writer, and organiser, but you probably know her name as co-chair of the Kurdish People's Assembly in the UK and an activist of the Kurdish women's movement, where she communicates the aim of the Women's Liberation Programme around the world. It's a pleasure to be joined by Elif Sarican. Elif, over to you.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Shelley. I want to start by thanking Abolitionist Futures and Pluto Press for putting on such a crucial series of events, and particularly this event, especially given during the last year or so, because of the coronavirus pandemic, certain very pressing and serious political issues have been quite under discussed and quite under acknowledged. So I'm really glad this is happening, and hopefully this discussion also is another very crucial step in towards bringing together some very important and effective areas of organizing around this, because there's a lot of work that is going on and has been going on for many years, but I think actually quite true to the topic we're discussing in terms of the criminalisation of solidarity, a lot of this work also has remained and actually unfortunately continues to remain quite fragmented. And I think this is really telling of the environment that this very topic has created. I also want to thank Kevin for setting the scene of this discussion so well. And I think, again, sometimes we forget and we miss some of the basics of particularly the way the state operates in this arena. So thank you very much for that. I want to start in some ways by reiterating some of the things Kevin just touched on, but particularly in terms of the Kurdish community, the criminalization of our community is by no means a new one. Our community has been criminalized since they arrived in this country, or since they started becoming diaspora in also other parts of Europe, but also other parts of the world. And the different forms of criminalization has been something experienced not just by Kurdish activists, but also by very ordinary Kurdish community members as well. Members of our community have experienced their houses being raided by a special branch, being harassed at the border in a deeply racist way as well. I've experienced it myself, but I've also experienced other people experience it. So I was born here, so of course I can communicate and express myself a lot easier. But the racism that I've seen, special branch police officers inflict upon other members of our community, and of course I have experienced this directly through our community, but unfortunately I know that this is more or less a universal thing for many migrant communities in the UK, but also internationally. And I say internationally because I think when we discuss the issue of the criminalization of solidarity, we also often forget that this is an internationally coordinated policy of nation states as well. Again, Kevin alluded to the start of the century, and when we look at the so-called global war on terror, I think one of the turning points in state policy was essentially the so-called global war on terror becoming an ideological pillar of the nation state. And through that, and the connection is not often made, but through that, one of the main attacks carried out through these policies was an attack against international solidarity, and solidarity in general, but particularly international solidarity, and solidarity not just between communities, because we've really seen the fragmentation of that was further cemented by neoliberal policies, but also particularly in the UK by for example the Blair government, when there was this encouragement of very apolitical community leaders. So you could become a community leader, and apparently that we are this very diverse country, and we're very proud to we're very proud to represent it or demonstrate it or display it, but actually you can't be political. And I think there is this question of like political agency when it comes to solidarity, and especially the experience of criminalizing solidarity, because one of the main approaches of the British state, but also states internationally, but I think particularly of the British state, which I think sets it apart from some other states around the world, is that people are criminalized in a very criminal way. And I know that might not make sense initially, but for example, in Turkey, there is a recognition that this person is carrying out politics, for example, but you will be sent to prison and tortured anyway. But in Britain, often there isn't even the recognition of a political agency, or that you are carrying out politics. You are just mere bandits, or you're criminals. You're not even the status of politicalness or politics is not even bestowed upon especially migrant communities. And I think this is also a way that quite a deliberate and intentional strategy that has been carried out to also ensure the least amount of criticism of these laws and policies as possible. And we see this, and unfortunately, it's largely worked. Very large sections of the left, even, I'm not even getting into other sections of society or, you know, political arenas, but even very large sections of the left are very, very rarely critical, for example, and particularly of terrorism laws. And usually what the argument is about is that this person or this organization shouldn't be on that list. There isn't a challenge of the very list existing in the first place. And we've seen this in many aspects. You know, I've been to meetings about Prevent and again about Schedule 7 and so on. And it's, you know, there's like specific and individual and quite neoliberal arguments actually about why this particular organization or this particular individual or this particular group should not be on it. And even when, I think, was it last year or the year before? I think it was last year when that image of the symbols as a guide came out, the majority of the arguments was about individual symbols and why they shouldn't be on that list, not that this list exists in the first place. So I think that's why when we talk about the criminalization of solidarity, there's a few points we should be talking about. One is who we call terrorists, and when we call, for example, fascists or far right terrorists, who are we doing favors for when there is obviously, terror is a descriptive word, but terrorist is an ideological word, and all of us fall into this. And I think we need to have mechanisms that we can remind ourselves that actually often these kind of terms that we inflict on others actually are going to affect people like us even more than anyone else. And when we see this, you know, in our community, what some of the issues we've started to face is not just that successfully the state has been able to compromise international solidarity between struggles and communities, but even within communities. So, you know, this, you know, Kevin spoke about like the collection of information and data and how it's being done on an industrial scale. Part of that is because members of communities are encouraged to be informants on their own communities as well. And because the apolitical display of, you know, carrying out politics and doing politics, there is rarely a recognition that the actions or the campaigns or the protests or demonstrations have a direct political connection. So what often we do, and I'm really excited to hear Mel speak, is what you often have to do is convince panels of people or the public that what you did was political before you can go on to challenge in other aspects of these very worrying and dangerous laws and policies that exist. And just lastly, I wanted to touch on the international aspect of it. So there is a deep international cooperation between states. I myself have been questioned by a special branch here as you know, when I'm re-entering the UK countless times, and been held for 6 hours at a time, and 4, 5, 6 hours at a time. And there was twice that for some reason the special branch guy decided to be a bit more honest, and he said, and I said, why are you doing this? Like, do you actually think I'm a terrorist? And he said, you know what, there's something called NATO, and Turkey is our NATO ally, so whether we like it or not, this is what we have to do. And so there was and no other special branch officer had ever been that honest. And for a second I was like, all the things we've been saying and been treated as conspiracy theorists are all true. And I knew that I didn't need that guy to confirm it, of course, but I think we don't recognize particularly the policing and intelligence cooperation between states, and how deeply embedded it is by you know, the foreign policy commitments of various different states. And I hope you know, further along in the conversation we can get into particularly the inherently criminalizing aspects of policing. Not that policing needs to change, but policing is inherently functioning in the way it is intending. I think most people on this call probably and obviously agree, but I do hope we will have those discussions as well. But crucially, that as we discuss, you know, there's a time that we're at a crossroads right now, that more people than ever recognize that the system is not the way it should and it's not functioning. But these kind of moments offer great opportunity, but also great risk, because there's also a chance for the international capitalist system to come back, you know, even bigger and stronger. So I think there's a lot of risks and opportunity like in this moment, and hopefully we can have some discussions that can take us forward in that sense. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Elif. I mean, you've obviously highlighted a really crucial element in this, which is racism, and the way that criminalisation of certain communities, whether it be Kurdish people, Muslim, Black people, is so tied to the criminalisation of solidarity. And that in itself requires solidarity, and that solidarity is then criminalised. And that question of who gets to be political is so key. And for many of them, the kind of most criminalised, it's often the case that you don't get to be anything, let alone political, because when you're already marked as a criminal on the basis of your identity or your accent or your appearance, even the most harmless things can kind of be a marker of a terrorist. You got me thinking about the report I saw this week about the 4-year-old boy who was referred to prevent, had police go to his house because a Muslim boy who'd been talking about Fortnite, the kind of kids' computer game at school. And the nursery staff thought, you know, this is a sign that he's been radicalized. You know, when you can't even talk about a computer game, how can you consider, you know, talking about real dissenting politics? Or in the same way, if you're a migrant, feared so much as a potential criminal, you could be deported. And on that note, our next speaker is a community activist and one of the Stansted 15, a group who were convicted under terror legislation for peacefully stopping a deportation flight in March 2017. Despite protests from civil society, Amnesty, and the UN, their politically motivated trial lasted 2.5 months, and they had faced the prospect of a life sentence on conviction. Just last week, their appeal was upheld and their convictions quashed. We're joined by Melanie Strickland, one of the Stansted 15. Mel, a huge congratulations to you and your 14 other comrades on the appeal. It's a huge relief to you, I know, and it's a huge relief to the movement as well. Mel, the screen is yours. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. It's really fantastic to talk to you all and to have had the benefit of hearing all the other speakers. So I just thought I'd start by just telling people what had happened that night. We were 15 activists dressed in pink high-vis and bright pink hats. We were wearing jumpers that said "Mass deportations kill." We entered through the perimeter fence, walked about 100 meters to where the deportation plane was being prepped. It was due to deport people to Nigeria and Ghana that night. And this was about 600 meters from the runway. So we had our scaffolding poles, and we erected a tripod. We unfurled a banner that said "No one is illegal," and we just stayed there. So in the course of our action, no one was hurt. The only damage was the damage to the perimeter fence, which the airport estimated to be £150. We were initially charged with aggravated trespass, which is a relatively low-level offence. But then some months later, for reasons we don't know, the charge was upped to Section 12B of the Aviation and Maritime Security Act, which is a piece of legislation that implements an international treaty on preventing terrorism at airports, primarily terrorism and acts of unlawful violence. So the this whole process, we took the action in March 2017. We were finally tried on the 1st of October 2018. So that's over 18 months later. And we were convicted on the 10th of December. So we had a 2.5-month trial. The trial just seemed to go on forever, and only 7 of us gave evidence. Our lawyers advised that others didn't give evidence just because it would just have dragged the case out for an incredible time. The prosecution in our case relied on theoretical risks, such as what would have happened had there coincidentally been a terror attack at the same time as our action. We had to wait 2 months to get the sentence. And during this time, we had no idea like how long, like what the sentence would be. I personally was told that I should expect 18 months to 2 years in prison. And if it was anything longer than that, then they'd try and appeal. But realistically, I would be looking at that amount of time in prison. The convictions were quashed last week, and the Court of Appeal held that we should never have been prosecuted for that offence and that there was no case to answer. What I find, so it's been nearly 4 years now of a legal battle for us. And what I find particularly shocking about all this, I mean, I'm still like trying to come to terms with it because so much has happened in that time, but every safeguard of what passes for our justice system, in our case, just seem to have failed. So, for example, for us to be charged with this offence in the first place, the Attorney General had to give consent. We had a judge who was overtly biased against us. Twice our lawyers, our legal team made applications for this particular judge to recuse himself, which he refused to do. We had so much support from civil society, including Amnesty and the UN, as was mentioned, who supported us as human rights defenders, which is, unprecedented that for them to support people as human rights defenders who are from this country. And doing activism in this country. The whole legal process was a punishment. It's had huge consequences. We couldn't work for all that time that we were on trial. We were far away from our homes and families in Chelmsford. There's been ongoing punishment in terms of like how a conviction like that affects our lives, trying to go for jobs with such a serious conviction. I mean, I feel like I've effectively been blacklisted. So yeah, huge consequences. And the psychological consequences and the pressure and the constant. We did an action, and it was a political action, but then we had such a serious charge against us, and there's sort of constant conflicts about how you how you present yourself. We couldn't express ourselves in court as we would have liked to have expressed ourselves. You know, we had to be mindful about shoehorning our how we expressed ourselves in terms of our legal defence, and that was a constant a constant challenge. Like how much do we kind of compromise ourselves, and what are we happy to say? Despite everything, we had so much solidarity from people. I don't think we would have been able to have put up with such a massive challenge without the huge love and support from so many people. I'm wearing my solidarity badge, which someone made for all of us. I don't know who. There were so many little kind of kind acts of solidarity like that there's just too many people to thank. The whole process was a flavour of what it was like for the people who we were acting in solidarity with that night. So, there are so many people whose legal status is insecure. Their right to their immigration status is insecure, and they have to go through years and years of legal uncertainty, and not knowing what's going to happen, not being able to plan. The legal process is extremely disempowering. It's designed to be that way. And I certainly have no regrets about what happened, what we did. We're still in contact with some of the people who were meant to be on the flight that night, and we know 11 people are still here. One of the people, for example, is currently doing her nursing studies, so she's a hero. And yeah, I suppose that's all I want to say, really. Just that the solidarity that we had, really, really kind of kept us going. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Mel. Really powerful to hear that, and it's such a really important result last week. And solidarity for the years that you've had to go through this, all of you. It's nice to know that you felt supported at least throughout. You mentioned you feel like you've been blacklisted, and I imagine that was absolutely the intention. In the same way that blacklisted workers are struck off for getting future jobs for their trade union activism, this is the state trying to make an example, as with so many other cases, to stop other people taking solidarity action in the future. But obviously we can't, and it's amazing to know that 11 people who were going to be deported that very night are still here, still living their lives as a result of the action you've taken. Thank you so much. Our final speaker is an author of 2 books on racism and the far right in Europe, with her latest book, Europe's Fault Lines, winning the Bread and Roses Award for Radical Publishing. She's the director of the Institute of Race Relations, where she has co-authored reports on crimes of solidarity against migrant rights activists. Liz Fekete, great to be joined by you. Last but not least, over to you, Liz.
Thank you, and it's an honour to speak after Mel. Mel, you said that the legal process is designed to disempower, and I think that we can all thank you and the Stansted 15 for empowering us. So thank you for that. These are dark times. These are really dark times. And I want to just just say at the beginning that we must remember that there are many, many more people out there across Europe, particularly the captains and crews of search and rescue vessels, who have been waiting and waiting and waiting through a similar legal process as Stansted 15. So we remember them and we thank them as well tonight. Thank you to the organisers for inviting me to speak. We are desperately in need of radical thinking and solidarity thinking, because states are involved in a massive power grab at the moment. Crimes of solidarity at the centre of that power grab, because if states are going to wrest more power away from the judiciary, away from us, the community, they actually have to remove the witnesses to their crimes. So it was great to be asked to invite to speak, because it made me sort of reflect a little bit more. At the Institute, we produced 2 reports in 2017 and 2019 on crimes of solidarity against migrant rights activists. We looked at prosecutions in the second report of 99 people. And I suddenly realized as I was preparing for tonight that these aren't just crimes of solidarity with, they are crimes of solidarity against what states now hold to be sacred. Hannah Arendt once said that anything that takes the form of a religion is a religion. And I think today borders, state security, law and order, effective immunity from the police, from prosecution, are what is held by states as sacred. And that's central to this discussion. I'm going to try and be very quick. It's very, very difficult because there's so many cases that I'd like to tell you about, but I just can't, I haven't got the time. But I want to talk a little bit about migrant rights activists and what's happening around Europe. I really agree with Elif's point about we have to see this in an international perspective, and we have to understand that states learn across each other. And that's what they've been doing in the European context. So I'll talk very briefly about what's happening on the ground at the moment in terms of migrant rights activists, but I also want to make some quick points about what's happening in terms of anti-racism and also the Black Lives Matter movement. So first, in relation to the migrant activists and the search and rescue NGOs, my feeling is that actually states are learning that high profile prosecutions can sometimes backfire against them. There's been quite a lot of legal victories, particularly in France, I think, around individuals being freed by the courts for so-called crimes of solidarity. So I think actually what they're trying to do is create an almost like crushing bureaucracy, a system of harassment and blockage at every stage. So we see the kinds of things we've seen with the Stansted 15, like prosecutions that take years to go through the system and at the end will result in acquittals or might even be dropped at the last minute. But we've also seen a combination of the use of national security laws, criminal administration laws, immigration laws, shipping and aviation laws, to really sort of crush people, impounding of vessels, harassment of the food line when people are trying to distribute food at places like Calais. And like I say, just a general immobilizing of people through fines and daily harassment, bans on the distribution of food and water. But I think one thing that we should look at very critically as something that we should be worried about here is the deregistration of NGOs giving support to migrants and refugees. And this is seen most clearly in Greece, where groups now have to apply to become part of an official registration and monitoring scheme or be deregistered. And registration is dependent on signing confidentiality clauses. Of course, this is all accompanied by a hostile rhetoric aimed at delegitimizing migrant rights groups, and of course, through them putting a tar on migrants themselves. So, when we see the kind of rhetoric that Priti Patel has used against immigration laws, and really she's saying the same things as Matteo Salvini, the extreme right leader in Italy, the way she's trying to create a system where immigration lawyers are seen almost as enemies of the people in collusion with traffickers and smugglers. I think, again, we've got to see this as part of a power grab, especially if the government succeeds with getting out of the European Convention, giving us a British Bill of Rights and limiting judicial review. Quickly moving on to the two other areas. Very, very worrying. In the last few months, we've seen the same logic and the same deregistration attempts against two leading anti-racist groups in Europe, the Collective Against Islamophobia in France, which the government tried to dissolve, but they were actually rather clever, I think, because they dissolved themselves first and transferred their operations to another European country. We've also seen the use of charity laws to deregister Kisa, an important migrant support group in Cyprus. 6 of their staff have over the years been arrested and harassed by the police. So finally, the final category is the whole area of Black Lives Matter and police racism, because I think some of the kind of attempts to, I can't say that word. I'm going to have elocution lessons. Part of the attempts to I can't say it. Forget it. I won't say it anymore. Black Lives Matter is actually to make campaigns around Black deaths in custody to sort of, I've got to find another word, to actually make them look bad. So what I'm seeing in Europe has actually a number of strategies happening. Of course, we've got the whole question of preventing journalists and others taking photographs of police actions. Of course, we've got the Andy Atchison case at Napier Barracks that's just happened. We've got the French security bill, which outlined the publication of images with the intent to cause harm or physical or psychological damage to the integrity of the police. And we've got the Spanish law for the protection and security of citizens, which introduces new crimes of obstructing authority. But we've also seen the use of libel laws to restrict what families and friends and campaigners can say in deaths in custody cases. There's many cases of those over the years I can tell you more about. There just isn't time. The first case that I was involved in was Marwa El-Shabini, a Muslim woman who was killed. Unbelievable case. She was giving testimony against a neo-Nazi who then killed her, stabbed her to death in the courtroom. And the police came and actually shot her husband, who was trying to protect her. He didn't die, he survived. But an academic who tried to say that this could have been to do with sort of racial profiling was then subjected to a libel action by the police. And police trade unions in other countries are beginning to bring libel actions against campaigners. And I think we should be worried that we're beginning to see the equivalent of the US Blue Lives Matter movement coming to Europe. One final case in this category to mention is the Adama Traore case in France, where the sister and brother have been subjected to libel actions by the mayor of the arrondissement where Assay's brother died. Finally, in the UK, I would like to mention the case of Edson Costa, who died after swallowing drugs and being subjected to a dangerous restraint procedure with CS gas used close to his face. In that case, the coroner asked each member of the jury to reveal if they or any member of their family were involved in any campaign such as Black Lives Matter. I think that set a dangerous precedent. So just to finally conclude by saying that state power is beginning to follow a very totalitarian logic. And all those who stand outside the totalitarian logic, who don't hold that borders or state security or the police have the right to use violence and kill people, are treated almost as heretics, as dissenters. So I think, we should embrace that. I'm going to embrace it. We are the new heretics. And if we are the new heretics, we need to come together. As ever, the old sayings are the best. If they come for me in the morning, they will come for you in the night. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. I think really interesting to hear about what's happening in Europe and in the US as well with Black Lives Matter and what that might mean for us here. And I want to come back to that in the discussion, if I may. I'm really glad you mentioned as well the case of the photojournalist arrested this week at Napier Barracks, because we're talking about the criminalisation of solidarity, but there's clearly a real crackdown on the free press and their right to critique the state as well. We're now going to do a bit of a discussion amongst the panel, and I'm going to throw some questions at you all in order of what you spoke. But please, as well, feel free to come in and question each other. Starting with you, Kevin. I know there was a few things you wanted to expand on and come back to, so please do feel free. But one question I wanted to put to you in particular is the new Covert Human Intelligence Sources Bill, otherwise known as the Spy Cops Bill. I understand correctly, it's not yet been made an act. How can we expect this to be used against solidarity campaigners?
Well, the crucial thing about the bill is that it's intended the bill was introduced because there'd been a legal challenge to the use of covert sources, and what the government was trying to do was therefore say, okay, well, fair enough, if the courts have decided that these are unlawful, then we're going to change the law. So much of the focus has been on, for instance, MI5 killing people, because unfortunately people in this country seem to have a weird obsession with James Bond. But actually, one of the greater truths is that it's going to be used in a variety of different contexts on a much lower level. And in terms of political dissent, it's absolutely going to be used on people who, to go back to what I was talking about before, who've attracted that label of being an extremist. I mean, not just the police, a variety of different people will then be able to pass on information, but predominantly we're talking about the kind of political policing units that have been responsible for the surveillance that have taken place on activists over the last, 3 or 4 decades. It's really interesting that what Liz was saying about Black Lives Matter, because it had, I was in the coroner's inquest when the coroner raised that questions with the jury. It was me, somebody from Inquest, and a reporter from The Guardian. I remember just my jaw absolutely dropping, thinking, how can you possibly get away with this? But this is about creating that situation where a label has such power that it delegitimizes, to use the word that Liz was struggling with, the public's right to have any sympathy with it, if you like. So, and it's very effective. I mean, we produced a report on the policing of Black Lives Matter protest last summer, and when it came to trying to get some coverage for that, the BBC set up all these interviews, and then at the last minute cancelled them because they said that Adam Elliott Cooper, who was the author of the report, wasn't sufficiently impartial enough. No, that never gets said about all those right-wing conservative think tanks that are well-funded that always end up on the media. It certainly wasn't said about me when I was allowed to go and talk about the previous year about the policing of Extinction Rebellion, and you kind of have to wonder what it was about a young black academic that particularly made them think, oh, okay, well, he's not legitimate. And that, so just on the to go back to your question about who is the targets, because I think that's all. The piece of legislation itself is actually just another piece of draconian legislation that enables surveillance. And in fact, covert human sources is only one small element of the bigger picture, the industrial scale surveillance that I spoke about before. Most of the information, to be honest, is information that we give away freely. The police are a very sophisticated analysis of social media, and unfortunately an awful lot of people are posting their entire campaign intentions and exactly where they're going to be going on Facebook. And we know this because a lot of those posts have ended up being used as evidence by particularly fracking companies recently, in order to be able to take injunctions against those campaigners. So there is a particular thing about the balance between people needing to be much more aware of their own security, and obviously the difficulty of wanting to be open and welcoming as campaigners. But the final point I wanted to just raise in terms of some stuff that was talked about. I mean, Mel talked about the reason why the Stansted 15 were suddenly slapped with this fairly obscure piece of counter-terrorism legislation, and the answer to that is clearly that it was deliberate. I mean, it's a sophisticated approach to, again, the labeling of campaigners. Over the years, just to reflect something that was said by Elif, I've spoken to a lot of Palestinian solidarity campaigners over the years from this country, and it kind of breaks down into Palestinians who are very cautious about what they say, and particularly worried about what undercover, or even counter-terrorism police might have to say to them. Muslim students in particular have the similar concerns about wanting to speak up. But even those who have got a relative degree of privilege and feel that they can push back against, for instance, a counter-terrorism officer that's linked to a university walking into a public meeting and sitting on the front row where everybody in the room knows who they are, will quite legitimately say, if we make a big issue about this, we're going to scare people off. And how are we going to be effective as campaigners if that happens? So certainly the point that I was trying to raise at the beginning, which is that the link between surveillance and the kind of broader threat of terrorism, which maybe wasn't there before. Before it was communism, now it's really about the link with terrorism, is actually a really important point. There's a really smart little line I remember reading from a Chicago Tribune journalist who in a book called Green is the New Red, talking about the surveillance by the FBI in the 2000s on environmentalists and animal rights activists, who said if you'd gone back to the 60s using that same approach, they would have had the lunch counter-terrorism bill that would have been designed to stop people from being involved in the civil rights movement. It wouldn't just have been straightforward repression, it would have been a deliberate attempt to try and associate them with terrorism. Obviously at the time, that is exactly what happened with people like Martin Luther King and links with communism. Terrorism is the new communism, basically. And it's incredibly easy for you to be associated with that. And as I said, it means that if you're going to be involved in some campaign that becomes the focus of police's attention, that also means that you're likely to have to at least consider what you do to protect yourself from that surveillance.
Thanks, Kevin. I want to come back to you on what exactly people can do to protect themselves in a bit, if that's okay. But Elif, first of all, thinking about the way the Kurdish community is criminalised, as you spoke about, how do we build the campaigns of solidarity with the community and indeed other communities, for that matter, to kind of build a wall around them and challenge that racist policing?
I mean, that's a really big question, but also an equally and deeply crucial one. I mean, there isn't something that I can or we can prescribe in terms of how that could be built, as in there isn't a ready-made model in that sense. But I think it's important, first and foremost, to do a mass political education of what is exactly going on. And of course, with that recognition, then you build the solidarity between communities, but also amongst communities, understanding things like one of the members of the Kurdish Assembly is also a teacher, and in a borough in North London, I won't say which just in case they don't want me to, but they, of course, are subjected to prevent training, and they were invited to a mass meeting by the borough to, they have to do this every term, whether it's, updated, and they get retrained essentially. And the prevent officer, she says, what do you think is the biggest threat that the kids of this borough are facing? And, people put their hand up and said, poverty, food poverty, access to, various actual things like housing. And then she says, no, you forgot the biggest threat that these people, kids are facing nowadays. And this is the list in order: ISIS, the PKK, anti-Semitism. And this is the biggest threat in a borough, and again, in a borough that has some of the highest rates of child poverty in the country. Apparently, these are the biggest three threats. And she said, and she's a political person, but she said, I just didn't feel equipped enough to get up and challenge it. And I think this is fundamentally what we also need to be able to do, is equip people to also be able to challenge these discussions or challenge these narratives when they're happening, but also understanding things like Schedule 7, prevent, so-called safeguarding, the way the Charity Commission is used against communities, particularly and community politically active communities, that these are fundamentally connected. You know, these mechanisms that are used by the state are fundamentally connected. And to understand this, that, you know, Kevin said terrorism is the new communism. And again, the consistency is that is, you know, the so-called global war on terror since the start of the century, I think it's quite comfortably, we can say, has not really actually fought against terror very effectively, has it? You know, I'm a part of a community and a people who were essentially forced to fight against ISIS by these very countries that, you know, created the policies that allowed for the environment for these kind of situations to arise. So we can comfortably say that the so-called global war on terror has not prevented terrorism or terror. But I think what is the similarity between, you know, the so-called fight against communism and the fight against terrorism is to cement what particularly the capitalist nation state proclaims to the world, is that this system may not be working, but it's all you're going to get. And this is the end of history. And, you know, as Thatcher said, there is no alternative. And this is what it is. It's to time and time again cement the mechanisms to prevent any kind of meaningful alternative coming about. And I think, you know, this of course comes from also the disproportionate policing and surveillance of, for example, environmental and ecological campaigns and struggles, because again, that kind of struggle and those kind of campaigns are also fundamentally challenge the profiteering that happens through capitalist systems. So I think the question of how to build solidarity is the recognition of exactly what these laws are. And I think, you know, Kevin mentioned something really crucial. Actually, people often don't really do anything, and this is something that has been discussed very much for many years in the Kurdish community. You know, what do we do? Should we do a class actions case? Like, what do we do? But actually, there are so many ways in which our community is, there's attempts for our community to be depoliticized, and for the mobilization of our community to be compromised, you know, particularly as the Kurdish community, one of the most politically mobilized diasporas in the country. There is a very concerted attack. You know, we had attacks from the Charity Commission, from, of course, you know, more recently Prevent. Schedule 7 has been, you know, has been used against our community for many decades. And again, and I say this over and over again, this is not an extraordinary experience of our community. This is unfortunately quite a universal experience of particularly politically active migrant communities. And often the reason why we're here in the first place is usually because of British policies. And then, you know, when we're trying to organize and mobilize our communities to be politically active, we often find ourselves having to compromise certain things. And it's really difficult to bring yourself and equip yourself in a way to say, actually, I'm not going to do that anymore. So again, I guess the short answer is to equip people in understanding it. These laws and these policies are deliberately overcomplicated as to make the understanding of them as difficult as possible, to equip people to be able to talk about these, and building on that to bring communities together, particularly in a very fundamentally internationalist way. And, you know, there's a lot of re-energizing happening in many areas and arenas of work. You know, one of the organizations that put this on is, for example, Abolitionist Futures. There's, you know, abolitionist work going on. There's work around migrant rights and migrant struggles. There's housing struggles, rent struggles, and so on and so forth. But often internationalism is seen as a bit of a, you know, as a bit of an add-on to these areas of work. But it needs to be fundamental, and we don't need to recreate the wheel, because a lot of the most effective struggles, even if we just look at the UK, you know, from the 60s and 70s and 80s, you know, throughout history have always been fundamentally internationalist. So it's not like we need to create something and do something that has never been done before. In some ways, we need to look back at the resistance history of also where we are and learn from that, and understand that it's not internationalism, a true internationalism isn't a compromise to the more localized work we need to be doing, but quite the opposite. It's how we strengthen our work and our struggles. So yeah, I think there's a lot of work to do in terms of the political education that is necessary to be able to struggle in this arena. But I think equally, it's very crucial for the alternative that we so desperately need to build as well.
Thank you, Elif. Completely agree that, you know, international solidarity can't just be an add-on, it has to be central to everything. And building on what Elif has been saying, and touching back on what you were saying before, Mel, about, you know, the level of solidarity that you received these last 4 years, how key do you think that was in, you know, the result of the appeal last week? And also, what lessons can we take from that, you know, for campaigns and solidarity movements going forward? And I guess also thinking about, in this current moment, the way that we're all living in a pandemic and we kind of can't come together in the usual ways, what can we learn from it in that context as well, in terms of what we do?
I think that the solidarity was absolutely, you know, key in ensuring that we didn't go to prison in the first place. My feeling is that I am someone who comes from, I used to think of myself as like an environmental activist. That's what my environmentalism, that's how I spent most of my time. You know, since I became sort of politically active, very involved in anti-fracking struggles, climate change. I'd previously done an action at Heathrow Airport protesting against the expansion of Heathrow Airport. I think what really perturbed the state in the Stansted action was the fact that people from you know, this kind of background were working, you know, did an action in solidarity with migrant communities and people. So the flight was to Jamaica and Ghana. You know, there was very clearly, like, you know, people of colour being, you know, who, as Elif said, you know, people are often here, you know, we're deporting people to former colonies, where, you know, we've, you know, largely destroyed their countries, and then we're pushing them out of the country without any due process at all in so many cases. So I think what the state was very concerned about was the solidarity between environmental activists and people who are in detention. And it's been most enriching for me and for the others to do something that seemed sort of so tangible. And, you know, one of the most touching things for me was women in Yarl's Wood wrote a long statement of solidarity as they themselves were on hunger strike, you know, you're really militantly challenging the you know, their unjust condition of being imprisoned in that way. And there were so many other things as well. Like, so much happened in this time, but I think that's what most concerned the state. I think that was much more concerning to them, and actually my feeling about why the charge was changed to the much more serious charge was there was an exclusive in the Morning Star. A journalist had done an investigation and did lots of freedom of information requests, and apparently Stansted Airport had actually threatened to stop taking high-risk deportation flights to countries like Nigeria and Ghana, and actually told, it was Theresa May at the time, that or Amber Rudd as Home Secretary, that in the future they might not take deportation flights at all. And then we knew that people were being deported from other military airports actually for some time, Brighton Norton, for example. So anyway, I think the solidarity between migrant communities and activists was a lot more threatening to the state, and that solidarity was in terms of the threat to the state a lot more powerful than, you know, the UN or Amnesty or the Institute of Race Relations and organisations like that supporting us. The threat of the working class or you know, different groups of communities kind of stitching themselves together and you know, fighting that oppression in a unified way was, yeah, I mean that was really threatening to the state, and I had learned so much about, yeah, how we can take forward that struggle by genuinely, it's really difficult to do, but that has to be the way forward, like, you know, working with these communities.
Thanks, Mel. I think you've made a very spot on point there, that some of this work is incredibly difficult, but it's absolutely necessary. I just want to remind people that are watching, please post questions to our fantastic panel in the comments box, and I will come to you very shortly. We've only had one or two so far, so it'd be great to get a few more. And those on the panel, please feel free to do that as well. You know, you're very much an audience as well. So pop those in there. Liz, just finally to come back to you as well. You mentioned before the deregistration of anti-racist organisations in Europe, a recent development. Is that comparable at all to actions we've seen here in the UK? And I'm thinking, and Elif mentioned them before, the Charity Commission. And then also, do you think that we're seeing in the mainstream a better analysis of race and class now, you know, with movements like Black Lives Matter? Are you, dare I say it, hopeful for the future?
Yeah, okay. Quite a lot of questions there. Can I just say first, Shelly, that I just wanted to respond what Mel said, because I just totally agree 100% with everything she said, although, you know, I'm a bit upset she doesn't think the Institute of Race Relations is going to bring down the state. But leaving that aside, I totally agree with every word. You know, it's when people turn up in situations where they're not expected, that is what's so threatening to, you know, authority that's trying to keep us in our boxes. We need fusion. We need fusion of all our struggles: environmental, anti-racist, Black, not blue. We don't want Blue Lives Matter, but we need fusion. We desperately need fusion. So I totally agree with everything that you said. In terms of, is there a parallel with the deregistration of Kisa and Collective Against Islamophobia in France, with the kind of stuff, the culture, the political culture we've seen developing out of the anti-terrorist laws with the Charity Commission? Absolutely, yes, there is a parallel. You know, Sivanandan, who's sort of very well known as a sadly dead 3 years now, but as a key analyst of race and class, always used to say to us, to me when I was Mel's age, hundreds of years ago, that, you know, this is a blotting paper society. Britain is a blotting paper society. It absorbs and negates protest. And I think that, you know, what we see here is sometimes a little bit more sort of sophisticated and catching you out than we see in other European contexts. So the stuff in Greece with the registration of NGOs is so sort of openly, you know, openly against principles. Whereas, you know, in the UK, I think the British government sometimes goes against things a little bit more sort of, you know, maliciously, but with intent and in stages. So yes, I see it as a parallel. In terms of, am I hopeful? Yes, I'm very, very hopeful about the future. I think that we are in a time of, as I said at the beginning, radical thinking. People, I think, have now realized that solutions are not going to come from the center of society. following the news today, and I won't be specific, we see that a major political party is embracing a nativist agenda. We're not going to get anything from the mainstream. There is only us. And I think that, the new kinds of organisation that we're seeing, that the hunger for radical ideas, abolitionism is something that is very, very profound and very deep and very deeply rooted in history as well. So yes, I'm very hopeful for the future.
Thank you so much, Liz. I just want to we haven't had any questions, but Ahmed M16 has done what he's called a shameless plug about a book that brings together people's stories on political violence, condemnation, or commentary on the structures of power, keeping tabs on us. It's funny that he mentions it because I've actually got it sat here. It's been brought together by Asim Qureshi, who was actually a speaker in last week's session. So definitely check out the book, but also check out the recording from last week's seminar. And this week's one, because somebody's asked, it is being recorded and it will be uploaded to YouTube, and you'll be able to see it on the Abolitionist Futures website. Kevin, I just wanted to come back to you for one final question as well. You talked about the risks people are opening themselves up to when they post things on Facebook or take certain actions. Of course, obviously our answer isn't to ask people not to take solidarity action, but how do we make people more aware of their own security when they're organising? If you can give us a little quick tip.
Yeah, but it's a difficult one, isn't it? Because I get people saying, "Are we like to be spied on?" And the answer is, well, it depends. It depends largely, actually, on whether you're effective as campaigners. Are you being annoying enough for the state to want to target you? But there is a difficulty because there is this balance. On the one hand, you can get so obsessed with the idea of security that you end up becoming, well, groups have become, deeply paranoid and suspicious about people, about infiltration and whether somebody's an undercover officer and so on. But on the other hand, the kind of alternatives that are available to groups, and which have tended to be used, is things like using the embracing of respectability in order to be able to kind of fend off the criticisms that may attract policing or surveillance by the police, and which has limited value in our view. I think what we say to people is, both as individuals and as campaign groups, is that you need to plan ahead. In everything we do as campaign organisers involves planning, but yet quite often the issue around security gets left to kind of an incidental thing that people don't think about. And a lot of the groups that I've worked with over the last 6 or 7 years have been new campaigners who have really not thought about security at all. And most of it's just common sense, So as a group, you may well make some form of security plan. So, which doesn't mean anything, it isn't as scary as it sounds. It means thinking about what information do you have that is potentially sensitive, membership lists, for instance, or a database of contacts is something that you should be saying, okay, we need to give some particular thoughts to securing this, thinking about what the potential risk might be about what would happen if that information is leaked. And as an individual, I think the really crucial thing is to agree with that kind of collective approach. So there has been a tendency of people to go, oh, I don't need to worry about this, I'm a super activist and I don't care what the police say about me. Well, it's not about you. These are collective actions. But the other thing is to also think about what you post on Facebook. Facebook is a public forum. Not just Facebook, actually Twitter, but other forms of social media. But sharing your entire plans online poses the risk that the police will undertake activities to try and disrupt what you do. And this has certainly been something that we've said over the last couple of years to Extinction Rebellion, and to a certain extent those lessons have been learned by some of the groups who are involved in that movement. You need to think ahead and think about what you share and whether it incriminates others, And if you don't do that, actually what you're not doing is that crucial thing that I think the left should be doing, should always be doing, which is thinking about solidarity and how we look after each other. And if we don't follow that, then I guess, what is the solidarity for?
Thanks, Kevin. That's really useful. As is always the way, there's a couple of questions from the audience that have come in, you know, very last minute, but I think they're really great. So I'm gonna put them to you guys. I've got two here. First of all, in Corporate Watch, the UK border regime, they make a comment about hope in government incompetence in implementing surveillance technology. Certainly, we've seen this with COVID track and trace on an Excel spreadsheet. Can we take advantage of this incompetence? And the second question is, it's quite encouraging that some state crimes are starting to go to court. Salvini may face kidnapping charges. Who do you think should or is likeliest to end up in court in the UK or the EU? Liz, can I come to you first? I have to ask people to be really quick, by the way, we've not got long left.
Well, I mean, the head of Frontex, the so-called border mission of the EU, is under a lot of pressure at the moment. I think he'd be a good candidate. I'm sure that if we did a poll, I'm sure if we did a poll amongst the audience, I think Priti Patel would come out quite high, don't you?
Yeah, I think a likely candidate, and perhaps her predecessors as well. Elif.
I mean, I think this is it's an interesting question, because I'm not one to really have I guess, like, government competence. Well, okay. I think the level of competence, unfortunately, doesn't mean whether, like, it's better or worse for especially the implementation of policies. In fact, I think I'm not one to call for a competent government, because I don't believe in the nation state. But in some ways, the more incompetent the government is, because there's these policies that they need to be implemented somehow, they're done in such an arbitrary way that actually it becomes a bit difficult. But I think what the important discussion needs to be about is, it's not necessarily to just react to a level of competence in the government, but also form our own program of how to resist the state and not just the government, because governments do come and go, but the mechanisms and the structures of the state are pretty much consistent, particularly in Britain, you know, which has quite a strong foundation as a state. The government, you know, of course, brings in certain laws and implements existing laws in certain ways, but ultimately it is the state that maintains a lot of these aspects. And particularly when it comes to criminalisation, when it comes to solidarity, when it comes to things like Schedule 7, it's not like any more competent government has been much different about it. I do think in some ways having an incompetent, unpopular government means that less people see the hope in that kind of like arena of politics to change things. So there's more like actual like movement organizing. So in that sense, I guess it could be quite promising. In terms of who is to appear in court next, I mean, whenever a state official appears in court, it's obviously always a political decision, as in when whatever the international order is, when whatever order may be is done with that particular individual, that's when they will appear in court. So I mean, there's calls by, like, you know, thousands or even probably millions of Kurdish people for Turkish President Erdogan to appear before the International Criminal Court. I mean, obviously it would be something of a promising, or in some ways a level of justice, but ultimately he happens to be an individual, although quite a fascist individual, who is representing a broader system. So I think when we are campaigning for more immediate and short and medium term results, I think we need to we need to always keep in mind the ultimate systematic struggle we should be in it for, which is, of course, to dismantle the state. Thanks.
Thanks, Elif. Mel, you probably don't want to be thinking about people being in court after the few years that you've had, but who would you like to see go to court?
Well, I mean, I don't think I have much further to add beyond what Elif said, which is, you know, I mean, it's just the whole sort of system isn't really ideal in any way, and you know, putting an individual on into the dock doesn't really sort of fundamentally change the system. It's the system that has to be dismantled. I mean, in the Stansted 15 campaign, we've always called for and continue to call for, like, the Home Office to be kind of completely dismantled and replaced with something else.
Thanks for that. We've not got long left, I'm afraid, guys. I just want to say we've obviously covered a lot in not a lot of time. But in the interest of not denying you your dinner, we're gonna close up shortly. Our next event, The Future of Our Civil Liberties, is taking place next Wednesday. Details of speakers and how to sign up can be found through the Eventbrite that you used to book this session. The event is going to look at how we build on this terrain to organise for the future. I want to remind everyone that Pluto Books are offering a 30% discount on their books using the code AF30 to anybody that's attending tonight. So write that down, AF30, get ordering some new reading material. I also suggest you check out Abolitionist Futures reading lists that contain articles, books and videos to help introduce abolition. There's also a guide on how to set up your own reading group on there. To close, and kind of following on from that note, I'd like to invite all our speakers to just share, you've got, you know, just in a few seconds, share a book, a website, a reading list, some kind of resource that people watching tonight can turn to learn more on this issue. And we've heard from him least recently, so I'll start with Kevin.
Okay, I've posted a couple of examples in the chat. I think if you really want to get a sense of what the state is prepared to do, then Rob Evans's book Undercover is a very useful starting point for really getting to understand why the undercover policing scandal is such a scandal. And as I said, there's a couple of other publications, particularly the one about the US, which is Green is the New Red, which I've posted in the chat. That would be, but if anybody wants to think about what surveillance actually means and the consequences, I'd start there with Undercover. It's a cracking book.
Thanks, Kevin. Liz, your recommendations.
Shelly, I've already put 3 reports that we published at the Institute on the chat. But I'd also just like to ask people, if possible, to sign up to our free anti-racist news service, which is www.irr.org.uk/news service. Comes out every 2 weeks.
Great, thank you. Mel?
Well, I'll definitely be signing up to the Institute news service. There's a fantastic book called The New Internationalists, recently come out, Activist Volunteers in the European Refugee Crisis by Sue Clayton, which is about, you know, the solidarity shown by volunteers all over Europe. It's really good. I've started reading it. It's fantastic.
Thanks, Mel. And finally, Elif.
There's 3 articles that have been specifically written about the criminalisation of the Kurdish struggle in general, so I can post those, and also some of the alternatives that I've kind of alluded to, but we didn't get much time to speak about, are the ideas of the Kurdish people's leader Abdullah Öcalan, and his latest book that has been translated to English is The Sociology of Freedom, printed by PM Press, so I recommend everyone go and read that.
Thank you so much, Elif, and thanks to everybody tonight for your contributions and the discussion. If anybody's got any further reading material they want to share, please feel free to post it in the chat box now. But thanks to everybody that's tuned in tonight. I think it's been really interesting discussion, really, really valuable, and I'm looking forward to the next in the series in the coming weeks. Thanks once again. Take care, everybody. Solidarity.